Before we get into the fate of Until Dawn 2, I'm going to briefly go over the history of 2015's Until Dawn. With the PlayStation 5 and PC release of the game close at hand, I will be somewhat vague in regards to story aspects, as to avoid too many spoilers for those that have not yet experienced the title. For example, I will be calling the antagonist creatures instead of their actual name. Until Dawn is a video game that released in August of 2015, exclusively on the PlayStation 4 and helmed by development team Supermassive. That wasn't always to be the case. The original idea for Until Dawn envisioned it as a PlayStation 3 title. The game would have featured a first-person camera style that would have seen players make use of the PlayStation 3's motion controller, known as the PlayStation Move. For those unaware, the Move controller contains sensors that allows for the detection of movement through one's motions. Think the Nintendo's Wii Remote. The way both controllers work is somewhat the same, and they also share a similar build, with the exception that the Move's controller has an orb at the top, which can be illuminated with various colours, and this leads it to being more affectionately referred to as a wand. Expecto Patronum! The first known version of Until Dawn would begin life in 2008, being developed by London Studio, which was formed in 2002 and owned by Sony. At the time, the team had a mix of people that worked on various games such as The Getaway, which is somewhat like Grand Theft Auto in some aspects, and another title being SingStar, a competitive karaoke type experience. They were also linked to having helped with the development of games that included Killzone and Little Big Planet. This iteration of the project was being developed on a heavily modified version of the SingStar engine. The Move controller would have been used to direct your actions, from where you would point your flashlight to opening doors, inspecting objects, solving puzzles, and performing a host of quick-time events. Instead of 8 characters that the eventual final release would see, the players would control just 2, with the ability to either play alone or with a friend. Players would take turns with the controller as the perspective changed between characters, an activity commonly referred to as couch co-op. The game would have focused less on supernatural elements in its storytelling. Instead of creatures being the antagonists, it would have instead been a killer stalking the characters around a mountainous environment. The story being inspired by slasher films such as Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer. The intro for the game would have been shown through the use of a live action style, forgoing the usual 3D animation of a cutscene. A completely different set of characters would have also appeared in the game. London Studios' version of Until Dawn would later, unknowingly to the public, be shown twice, albeit very briefly, with just a few seconds of footage seen amongst a montage of other games. One of these clips would have appeared in a Gamescom trailer that first premiered in 2009, with another clip being shown in 2010, in the form of a video reel showing upcoming titles for the PlayStation Move. Due to London Studios' apparent struggle to shape the form of the game and having it be produced in a reasonable amount of time, the project would be handed over to a different studio. And so on is Supermassive, who would mould the story quite differently to their predecessor, changing elements such as replacing the characters, now having 8 of those playable instead of just 2, and they would also replace the stalker antagonist with the more fear-inducing creatures, all whilst keeping some ideas that already existed in London Studios' version of the game, such as the setting, which included the snowy mountains and the cabin. They would for a time retain some of the previous team's mechanics such as first person, quick time events, and the way the player would interact with objects. The game also still geared towards being a PlayStation Move title. These mechanics were evidently still in the game and viewable in 2012 via a preview at Gamescom. Between then and the eventual 2015 release, some of these ideas, including the use of the PlayStation 3's Move controller and first person, would be dropped once the decision to move the game to the PlayStation 4 was made. Once development had been ported to the PlayStation 4, the game's direction would begin to flourish into what the official release would come to be, including changes with regards to environments, character designs, and the creatures having a less zombified look. The story would also largely remain the same upon transition between consoles. This time, instead of a movie showing brief flashes of scenes for the intro, which was present in the PlayStation 3 version, the start of the game would be vastly expanded, now being transformed into a player-controlled portion of the game, seeing the player take on the role of Beth. The game begins with a group of friends, Sam, Ashley, Jessica, Mike, Emily, and Chris being invited by the Washington siblings, Beth, Hannah, and Josh, to their family's cabin for the group's yearly trip to the Blackwood Mountains. Hannah, who is interested in Mike, would later find herself invited to his room, where she hopes to finally take their relationship to the next level. Unfortunately, the invitation was the beginning of a cruel prank orchestrated by the majority of the group. This act being designed to try and teach Hannah a lesson for crushing on Mike, who would occur as Emily's boyfriend at the time. Mike would persuade Hannah to start removing her clothes. Whilst this is occurring, Jess, who would accidentally give away her presents, along with the others, and revealing that they are recording the event. This would see Hannah feeling humiliated, distraught, and crying uncontrollably. She would then flee from the group, leaving the cabin and running into the dark, snow-blanketed wilderness. Her sister Beth would soon realize what had transpired and run to her aid. Beth would find Hannah in her distressed state. As Beth would try to comfort her, an unknown sinister noise could be heard close by. Hearing this, the girls decide to run and soon find themselves at the edge of a cliff. Hannah would slip while still holding on to her sister, causing Beth to be dragged off the edge with her. Beth, gripping for life and trying to hold on, with Hannah still clinging to her, would look up and see a masked figure trying to reach out to help. This would be presented to the player as the first major choice they can make. However, this is simply an illusion, as both choices will result in a similar outcome. A year later, on the anniversary of Hannah and Beth's disappearance, Josh invites the remaining members of the group back to the cabin. And with that, set in motion is a night that will ultimately change their lives forever. The official release would see the inclusion of a third-person camera system, the gameplay featuring exploration and multiple choice decisions. These decisions giving various outcomes which can possibly see the lives of the main cast of characters cut short depending on the choices that the player makes. Supermassive would also still keep some of London Studios' initially planned gameplay, some of those being the previously mentioned QuickTime events, using them as a way to add suspense and action to scenes and the interactivity of a vast amount of objects placed around the environments, some of which help to fill in chunks of the story that can easily be missed if adequate attention is not given when searching areas. Totems can also be discovered. These are a special type of item that will offer a glimpse into a possible future event via a clip being played. This can help the player prevent a potentially messy fate for the character that it relates to. There are 22 choices that can be made throughout the game, with various decisions for each of these. Taken into account along the way are also a purported 256 variations for situations. Some of these variations include which characters are dead, how other characters feel about each other, and the traits they have. The combination of these will see the game build up to its eventual finale, which can conclude in one or three different endings. Upon release, Until Dawn would see favourable reviews from critics. The game would also hit number 2 in the UK charts on its first week, and supposedly sold around 17,000 copies in Japan. Based on this, I would assume worldwide it sold decently, although I was unable to find exact sales figures for the first week. So the question for some may be, why has there never been an Until Dawn 2? The answer isn't completely clear. In 2022, Time Extension, a gaming news outlet, was doing an investigation into the work culture at Supermassive. The investigation's findings would never be released publicly, but during this period, some employees that had been spoken to would go on to supposedly speak briefly about Until Dawn 2. There are a couple of variations as to what may have happened. Allegedly, Supermassive did in fact want to make a sequel, pitching the idea to Sony. Sony would then agree to pay for the creation of a prototype. After Sony had paid for the prototype and it had been completed, Supermassive decided they were, as quoted, going to shop this around and see if anyone else wants it. In other words, they likely wanted to show it to other companies and see who would pay the most. Sony would hear about this, and that would be the end of the two companies having any kind of working relationship. The next possible explanation paints it differently. Again, allegedly Sony would decide to break their business relationship with Supermassive due to the latter's plans plans for their series known as the Dark Pictures Anthology. The issue being that it would be a multi-platform release instead of a Sony exclusive. The sources would go on to state The Quarry started as a pitch for Until Dawn, but they didn't have the license. They burnt their bridges with Sony by releasing Dark Pictures on multiple platforms. As far as I'm aware, someone else has that license now. Will Byles.
Hi everyone, I'm Will Byles, director of The Quarry,
who was writer and director of both Until Dawn and The Quarry, has come forward disputing claims, saying The Quarry was written as a standalone game and Sony paid nothing to its development. It was originally being made for Google Stadia. If we read between his words and look at what he is also not saying, he does not dispute that there could have been plans and possibly a prototype for Until Dawn 2. That could simply be because he had not been informed about the existence of any plans. Of course, that is if any did actually exist at the time. If we go back to the previous statements given allegedly by employees at Supermassive, we can see they do differ from each other, but both have a common connection. Both reveal that supposedly The Quarry began life as an Until Dawn project. Looking at the first statement, where allegedly Supermassive wanted to shop around the prototype that Sony had paid for to see if another company was interested, this would be the least likely to have occurred. This is simply because at the time Sony owned the IP for Until Dawn, and without Sony being on board, there would be no way to release Until Dawn 2. And this is possibly why Until Dawn 2 became The Quarry. I do not know Will Byles in any capacity. I can't say whether or not what he says is factual. I also can't say that the statements from supposed Supermassive employees are factual, as there's no official source given. If I were to make a definitive personal conclusion on if The Quarry started life as Until Dawn 2, I would lean towards that being the most likely case. Both games are similar in terms of gameplay style, although this by itself is a weak connection, as it's Supermassive's usual formula. If we look at an earlier version of the creature model from The Quarry, it does seem to share resemblances from the creatures featured in Until Dawn, both sharing similar body features such as long elongated limbs, long nails, hairless, and both also having canine-like teeth. If we look at the final version of the creatures model from The Quarry, it also still holds similarities to that of Until Dawn's creatures, again both featuring long elongated limbs, both hairless, canine-like teeth, and this time around both having somewhat similar head shapes. If we go to the setting and have a look at both of these as well, they are also somewhat the same. You have another cabin, again isolated from the world in a nature-based environment, with The Quarry taking place at a summer camp, whereas Until Dawn is set high in the snowy mountains. At the very least, if Will Byles is correct that The Quarry did not start life as Until Dawn 2, I feel at the bare minimum it was indeed the inspiration for its conception. I have no way to prove with solid conviction that The Quarry was at one point Until Dawn 2, or that there could have been plans and possibly a prototype for a sequel to Until Dawn. I do believe at some point that this was likely the case though. However, these are simply my own thoughts and assumptions. And with that, we've looked at the origins of Until Dawn, its many challenges, its many evolutions, and its potential sequel that would never come to be. Thank you for watching, I wish you all well, and for now, goodbye.